can avoid repeating the mistakes that they made. But at the end of the 40 days, the spies, or those who were sent to spy out the land, they returned and reported to Moses, Aaron, and the whole Israelite community at the Kadesh, or the Kadesh, saying that the land did indeed flow with milk and honey, but that the people who inhabited it were powerful, and the cities were fortified and very large, and that they saw the Anakites there in the land. Now this is interesting when we put this into, we contrast and we compare even today. If you look at what's going on in East Africa, if you look at Ethiopia, and right across the water, you understand, or the Red Sea is Yemen. We see the Arab world, what's going on. They're talking about Al-Qaeda. You see Somalia, Black Hawk Down. We hear about these wars and rumors of wars going on there. So when you speak to the lost sheep about coming out of Babylon or repatriating, you get some of the same sort of responses. Yes, the land is beautiful. Yes, the land is rich. It flows with milk and honey, proverbially speaking. It has minerals and resources that the whole world needs. You understand? But the people who are there, you understand, are viewed by many lost sheep, those who have the lost sheep consciousness, as being strong and powerful. And you go over to Africa and you know, you don't know what happened to you in Africa. You understand? Those Africans, you know what I mean? So people get this fear, the same sort of fear that the Israelites, that some of the Israelites had. But Caleb, he hushed the people. He hushed the people. Zim Asenya, you understand? He hushed them, and he urged the people to go up and to take the land. He said, we can do this. You understand? But the other scouts, or the other spies, they spread calumnies about the land. They spread like bad news, sad stories, you understand, to discourage people. And they even called it, the land, one that devours its settlers, one that eats you up. It's like how black people have been looking at Ethiopia by and large. You know, the famine, people starving there, people dying there, people getting killed there, people got AIDS there, people, you know, all these sad stories that we hear about Africa, and not even knowing just how big Africa is, that there's so much land that literally one can get lost in Africa. America could get lost in Africa, basically. That's how big Africa is, and you can see all the video on that. But the point is that there's so much similarity between the response of the Israelites, the spies and the Israelites at that time, and also the consequences. We're learning about the consequences for that double-mindedness. Basically, it was a diblaim. It was a double-mindedness. You understand? Yes, the land is beautiful. Yes, it is rich. Yes, it's our land. Yes, you know, we see it. But the people that are there, they're strong, they're powerful. They got, you know, they got everything all sewed up. And plus the land itself is so big that it will literally swallow you up. You understand? So they reported that the land's people were giants, and they also made an assessment. And this is kind of very interesting right here, that even this particular sabbatical portion is the portion that we touch on. I have a book here that was, I had this for some years. It's by Chaim Herzog and Mordecai Gihon, and it's called Battles of the Bible. And it was in this book, Battles of the Bible, I was looking at it the other day after so long, and it kind of spoke about this particular incident, you know, in comparison with like military warfare and military campaigns. And some of it I would like to share with you, because it talks about the background of the conquest of the promised land, how they had to, since they were so long in Egypt, while they was in Egypt, other people were in their land, the giants, the other ones, they were setting up shop. So other people felt that they had a right to the land more so than the Beta Israel, and they basically were preparing for war to basically fight off and to ward off. This is the same way for us as the lost sheep, as Rastafari, and as Ethiopian Hebrews. There's a lot of Ethiopians, careless though they may be, but who don't want us in Ethiopia or Africa, who don't like us, who are probably like some of the people of the land. They're strong, they're giants, they have everything sold up, they have armies, they have weapons of mass destruction, perhaps. You know what I'm saying? But the key thing was not who the enemies were or the giants were, but it's the reaction of the Beta Israel. So in this book right here, just to give you a little taste of this right here, it talks about, let me go from this page right here, setting the scene, on page 23 of Battles of the Bible by Chaim Herzog and Mordecai Gichon. It says here on page 23, it says, on the other side of the hill was to Moses encamped at the oasis of the Kadesh Barnea, the land of Canaan beyond the miles of barren rock and the sand of the Negev. The Negev is to say the Debub, or the south, the Negev. To find out how best to go about conquering it, Moses sent out 12 spies. Now the book of Numbers chapter 13, the very chapter that we're in for this 37 sabbatical Torah reading and feeding, the book of Numbers, or chapter 13, Asara Sost, it records the briefing Moses gave his reconnaissance troops. So now these Hebrews or Jews, you understand, they regard this as a recon mission. How interesting. This is regarded by the Jews that study this, and to some degree have implemented the wisdom or the system of this to gain certain benefits by this biblical system of organization and operation, that they regard this as a briefing that Moses gave his reconnaissance troops. What we just went through in the Royal Amharic Bible alongside the King James Version. Now, the need for a detailed briefing of the intelligence officer by his commander, or of the intelligence gathering agencies by the 10, has become one of the basic tenets of any modern intelligence operation. So any IO, or what's an intelligence operation, an IO, and the modern or military MIO, you understand, or MIO, is to gather certain facts, basic knowledge, and put it together to gain some understanding or intelligence. You understand? So what we have here is the basic tenets of any modern intelligence operation right here in the Bible. The items under discussion and their emphasis change from mission to mission. The items that are under discussion and their emphasis change from mission to mission, but according to modern official handbook, according to one modern official handbook, quote, the subject matter of strategic intelligence may be considered from two aspects. One, the capabilities of nations in sizing up others, the capability of nations. Two, and the intentions of nations. This is the very same thing if you know about the ghetto or street life. You have to first of all understand the capabilities of other posses and cliques, and then also be able to assess what are their intentions if you're going about this intelligently. Moses' business was clearly with the former. His first business was the capabilities of nations. Our handbook goes on to say that the capabilities of nations in war and peace are based on their natural and industrial resources, their political stability and demography, the character and the stamina of their populations, their armed forces, their scientific endeavor, their topography and infrastructure. So what we have here are, first of all, capabilities of nation in war or peace are based on, one, their natural and industrial resources, their political stability, their demography, how they're made up, and politically how they function. So we can actually pair this up. natural and industrial resources is 1. Their political stability and demography is 2. The character and the stamina, because the character determines the stamina, you understand, of their populations. Their armed forces, which is one whole topic right there. Their scientific endeavor, how well they deal with knowledge, you understand, and how advanced are they using modern technology. Their topography, you understand, how are they geographically located, and what sort of land do they have, do they possess, and infrastructure. What kind of structure is that society based on? So it says, compared with this guideline that's written over 3,000 years later, Moses' briefing, it seems surprisingly modern and in line with present day requirements. So what we're learning here is comparable with the best of the best, is what these Jewish military professionals, upon their analysis, and others have also done this. One thing we notice that most of the great nations, the great militarily, the Anglo-Saxon, the English, the European, certain European nations, the modern Jews, America, they all study this as some portion of their military academies. They all study the Bible. This is why most military organizations have some regard for God or the Bible and godliness on a certain level. You understand? Because they recognize there's as much wisdom to be gleaned from the scriptures. It's unfortunate the superstitious, careless Christians and our lost sheep people don't recognize that. But plantation Christianity will have you and keep you ass backward. So we have to come out of that. But Numbers chapter 13 verses 17 to 20, just to go over this once again, it says, "And Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said to them, and see the land what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not." One of the weaknesses and potential failings of intelligence reports has always been the fact that the recipient, the one who receives this intelligence, must base his planning and action upon the estimates and interpretations of others, and others by character, training, or inclination. Either or all of the above may arrive at conclusions different from those the commander would have deduced had it been in his power to take a personal look at, quote, the other side of the hill. So when we speak about the other side of the hill, one's mature brothers and sisters should understand what we mean. We're talking about the other side of the hill. You understand? Frederick the Great, his defeat at the Kunersdorf in 1759. I know maybe some of you know about this, some of you don't. Look it up. Frederick the Great's defeat at the Kunersdorf in 1759. Napoleon's reverse before Acre in 1799. The British disaster at Arnhem in 1944 probably would not have occurred had the commanders-in-chief been able to assess for themselves the facts on which their intelligence was based. And this is what makes our present Aliyah, repatriation, coming out of Babylon, returning to the promised land, settling and building on our inheritance, kind of difficult at certain stages vis-a-vis intelligence, vis-a-vis what kind of information and the quality of information and the character or the training or the particular inclination of the people that are giving us some of this so-called information. Hence, it is only natural that commanders have always impressed upon their intelligence gathering agencies the need to provide them with as much tangible proof as possible to confirm their reports. Moses was no exception, for he terminated his briefing with the following injunction, quote, "And be ye of good courage, and bring the fruit of the land." Numbers 13 and 20. So the spies, they heeded Muse's words and brought substance, evidence, substantiated their report about the natural products of the Kanaanu by carrying with them samples of the rich fruit that grew there. Most probably, this evidence did much to enhance the credibility of those items in their report, for which tangible proof could not be obtained. Quote, "The people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. Moreover, we saw the children of Anak there, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." Numbers chapter 13, verses 28 and 33. Another means of minimizing the dangers inherent in basing one's estimate upon the appreciations of others has always been to choose the most capable officers for crucial missions. And this is why the teachings, the discipleship, the studies, the growing at this level is so important in order for us to attain firmly and progressively the next level. You understand? This is why this level of study and emphasis on the word and training and getting familiarity with the wisdom of our Godfather of Kedamawi Haile Selassie, based on his book of glory, the Bible, is so important. Because if we, as a society of His Imperial Majesty, the line of Judah, we need to send someone. Who are we sending? Just someone who has the money to go, somebody who's willing. And then what will be the quality? What will be the organization? What will be the sort of discipline of it? Of course, people would say, hey, there's no problem for me. You could trust me, so forth and so on. But really, what is the quality of the information that we will receive? As we learn here, it's always best to send the most capable officers for a crucial mission. And for us, there's nothing more crucial than coming out of Babylon and returning to our promised land, to returning to the land of promise in covenant. That's where a lot of ones have made their mistake. They've erred because they may have gone and visited, but not gone and visited in covenant. That means they did not do those things in order. You understand? In God's appointed, in Jah's appointed. The 17th century, when it became customary to accredit ambassadors as permanent gatherers of intelligence at foreign courts, the French handbook stressed the importance of choosing a general of the highest caliber, as, quote, "he would be in a better position than anyone else to render good account of the forces of the country where he resided, the quality of the troops, the state of the fortified places, the arsenals, and magazines," not magazines like we know them today. Moses had already acted accordingly in his own day. One thing they don't discuss here, but we know that Moses was a general in Ethiopia, or in the Coptic land, you understand, of the Egypts, both Upper and Lower Egypt. But the Talmud and the Jews even have much writing in their Talmud and other studies about how Moses commanded armies in Ethiopia on behalf of the Ethiopians, a whole connection with Jethro, his Ethiopian wife. So he was well skilled. It's obvious that he was well skilled in military operations. So he acted accordingly in his own day, according to Numbers 13, 1-2, which is once again now returning to the very beginning of Shalach Leka, or Shlach Leka, or Lak Tilkalachu by Marinyas. You can even understand the similarity of the root, which both means to send, which both refers to send. The beginning of this sabbatical, Numbers 13, 1-2, it says, "The Lord spake to Moses, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of the Canaan. Of every tribe send ye a man, every man a ruler amongst them," to say the most qualified, you understand, in that sense, amongst them. In this way, the more optimistic appraisal of Joshua and Caleb was effectively overruled by the voices of the 10 other scouts, as would be done in any sort of a democratic or a republican sort of system. So when people talk about democracy, this was democracy there. basically the majority outruled, in a sense, and outweighed the minority, representing, some would say, the highest leadership in their respective tribes, these other 10. So their evaluation was sustained when the attempt to push straight north from Kadesh Barnea through the Negev into the Promised Land was foiled by the king of Arad. The king of Arad foiled their plans, and even in this sabbatical study we're going to read about a great defeat that occurred. There was a great setback and a great defeat that basically occurred in this particular sabbatical portion and reading. The tribal warriors were also incapable of assailing the walled cities in the Beersheba, the Beersheba or the Beersheba Valley. Archaeological research has revealed their pattern, and unable to stand up in open country to the heavy armed regulars, who probably included a unit of the dreaded war chariots. The scouts were vindicated, some say, and Moses therefore changed his plan from a direct to a more indirect, from a direct approach to the Promised Land to a more indirect approach, because of the quality of his men and their training. Remember, you had a whole generation who already lived much of their life in Egypt. It's like ones who lived the majority of their life in Babylon or in the wilderness here of North America. So their mentalities, and many of them not really being born really fully regenerated, their mentalities, you understand, still were on Egypt, because they even said after the report, the whole community broke into crying and they railed against Moses and Aaron as we go into the next chapter, chapter 14, and said, if only we might die in this wilderness. They were saying, well, it'd be better for us to just die in the wilderness. And basically that would happen to that generation until a whole new generation would be born and would grow up, you understand, in more of the covenant order, in conformity to the will of God, instead of being half civilized like their parents were. They had a little Babylon in them, they had a little Zion in them, you understand. But the children now, going through that wilderness experience now after the 40 years, they would have more of the Al-Qidan, the Banai Barit, the covenant, and that faith, you understand, in the Almighty to carry them through, like Joshua and Caleb. So Joshua and Caleb, they were not wrong coming from the position they were coming from, but then there were 10 other tribes and their leaders who basically were pathetic or apathetic. And that's what basically vindicated their report, because there are 12 tribes, not only 2. So the scouts were vindicated, and Moses changed his plans from a direct to more indirect approach. By a great detour, he skirted the well-defended kingdoms that had been established on the Transjordanian highlands some generations before the Exodus. So as we also have been in Babylon, and our parents and parents' parents, since we were originally given the land grant way back when, going back to the early 20th century, you understand, 1930, 31, 40s, and the 40s and the 50s, the 60s is the reconfirmed. People have been talking about it in the 80s and the 90s, and still we're here now in the so-called new millennium. And by this time of the dilly-dallying of the people, others have moved even into the Shashamani land grant. People say, oh, we lost that land. Well, look at what happened before and recognize, compare and contrast, recognize it's a repeat, because the same bad behavior scientifically will yield you the same bad results. So Moses took an indirect approach, moving on the fringes of the desert. He turned westward to assault the only weak link in the chain of the desert border kingdom. So he became more strategic, and he hit them at a weak spot instead of going against the stronger, more fortified spots. And that was the realm of the Amorite king Sihon. They took out Sihon, as well as many others, especially as the campaigns of Joshua would begin later on. But the Israelite intelligence service must have worked well among their kinsmen being the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites, who at this time were a little bit more inclined to be helpful and resourceful. It did not take them long to find out that Sihon had recently carved a kingdom out of the Moabite lowlands north of the Arnon River. His conquest had been achieved with great effort, and he had not yet had the time to fortify his kingdom sufficiently. It's similar to what we can see even in parts of Africa. If we would, discuss and develop to implement a strategy towards reclaiming our promised land, as we should have already been doing, but today is the acceptable day of salvation. Thus the Israelite, the Beit Israel, were able to invade and conquer Sihon's country and push out from there northwards to Gilead, which was at the time only sparsely settled. There they linked up with local Hebrew clans, with other brothers and sisters, you understand, and forged their still rather loose tribal structure into a semi-sedentary society of militant tribes, with the goal of capturing the whole of the promised land. So there's more to this particular part that we want to touch on, but wanted to give a good overview, as well as touch on some of the importance of this particular area of scripture. And we're coming to the hour mark on this particular clip right here. So what we're going to do is take a pause for the cause and to pick up on it, where we'll find that Moses and Aaron, they fell on their faces. Joshua and Caleb, they rent their clothes. They exhorted the Israelites not to fear. The Israelites were in an extreme state of fear and panic, and not to rebel against God. This is what we find that the lost sheep have done for the last 40 years of wandering in the North America and the Caribbean. Just as the community threatened to pelt them with stones, the community was so angry. It's just like back in the days, 40 years ago, you're talking about going to Africa. You understand? Black niggas in America didn't want to hear it. They were ready to curse you. That's what the pelt with stones symbolically was, to curse. So God's presence had appeared in the tabernacle, and God complained to Moses, which is very interesting. We'll go into a little more detail, but give you a little bit of a glimpse of what's upcoming in this particular sabbatical as we get into chapter 14 of Numbers. Ha-Elohim complained to Musa, and he said, how long will this people spurn me? Why they spurning me? You understand? And he threatened to strike them with a pestilence and make of Moses a nation more numerous than them. Now this is where I say that this whole idea of Ethiopian Hebrew is not a new idea, or better yet, Hebrew Ethiopian. Putting it in proper order, Hebrew Ethiopian is not for us at least. For them, they're Ethiopian Hebrews. We're Hebrew Ethiopian. Is not a new idea, because Moses was told that, get out the way. In other words, get out of my way. Let me kill off these bastards, these niggers, these complainers, these worthless, shiftless Negroes. Let me kill them off, and I'll make a great nation out of you, Moses. Who was Moses? Moses was a Hebrew. Who was his wife? She was an Ethiopian. His father-in-law was his initiate into the wisdom of the Egypts, called Yotor or Hobab. You understand? So a great nation could have been made out of Moses, and from that time it would have been a Hebrew Ethiopian nation, as we learn in Numbers chapter 14 verses 11 to 12. But we will find out that Moses, he told Ha-Elohim to think about what the Egyptians would think. Think about what the Egyptians would think, what they would say when they heard the were, when they heard the news, the gossip. You understand? About how the Almighty took them out of Egypt with these great powerful signs and wonders, and think that Ha-Elohim would be powerless to bring the Israelites to the promised land. In other words, what Moses appealed to was, look at the PR of it. I mean, look how that would have looked. Like people say, well, how come Haile Selassie didn't take black people back to Ethiopia, Africa then? If he did, can you imagine what would have happened to them, unprepared and moreover unwilling? You understand? But it's interesting, this portion right here. So Moses, he asks Ha-Elohim, the true God, to forbear. and he quoted Ha Elohim's self-description. He quoted God to himself. He said that, aren't you, I mean, you are slow to anger. You abound in kindness and generosity. You forgive iniquity and transgression in Numbers 14:17 to 18. Now, in response to this, Ha Elohim, he pardoned, but he also swore. He also swore an oath and said that none of the men who had seen God's signs, in other words, none of the men, in other words, it's almost like saying that none of those who had seen his imperial majesty in the time that his imperial majesty revealed himself would see the promised land, with the only exception of Caleb and Yehoshua, Joshua, and that all the rest that were 20 years old and up would die in the wilderness. That all of those who were 20 years or above were to die in the wilderness. And it's an important note that we have to observe, seeing that we have just come through a 40-year period of time similar with our promised land, Shashamani, Ethiopia, and all that was promised to Abraham by Ha Elohim in Genesis 15 and 18. You understand? Not that 10% that's known as the state of Israel, but the whole thing that the Almighty said. And consult Genesis 15 and 18, from the river of Euphrates to the river of Egypt, which encompasses the majority of East Africa, inclusive of Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, Arabia. All of that is ours. This is why what we see going on in the world today is a very interesting prophetic sign, you understand, for us, and that must come to pass. And we look on what's going on in the Middle East and that part of the world as a positive. And yes, there's going to be more war, rumors of war. You understand, there's going to be movements of people, great upheavals. But it's at that time that we're going to have to be prepared to make our move. You understand? In the midst of those things, not to wait for those things to relent like the fearful and unfaithful, but in the midst of those, but we have to say, well, who is of us and who is not of us? This is why Torah, the studies, discipleship becomes a standard. You know what I'm saying? Study and show yourself approved to God as a workman that need not be ashamed, rightly dividing or explaining the word of truth. Anyone who cannot rightly divide or explain the word of truth, you understand, is not of us, because they're not approved by Jah. They're not approved by God. So God said that the Israelite children would enter. He said that the Israelite children would enter. You know what I'm saying? Just like the so-called Negro children over here, the children of that careless generation of Negroes over here who roamed in the wilderness of North America, that the children would enter. You understand? But that the after the roaming in the wilderness and suffering for the unfaithfulness of the present generation for 40 years. So there was a 40-year time period, you know what I'm saying, corresponding to the number of days. That was to correspond to the number of days that the spies or the scouts had scouted out the land. They had scouted out the land in Numbers 14 verses 32 to 34. Now the scouts, other than Caleb and Iyasu, they died of the plague. It's very interesting. There was a plague. I mean, just like there's a plague right now among Negroes, spiritually, psychologically, and even moreover physically, there was a plague upon. If you look at black people's health in this present generation, so it's so interesting, because if you understand what black people had to go through in America, I mean, under more dreadful physical and even psychological conditions than what Negroes are going through right now, you will have to recognize there's a correspondence between the plague recorded in Numbers chapter 14 verse 36 to 38 and what's going on among the lost sheep, the careless, the disobedient. Early the next morning, to just sum this up, the Israelites set out to the promised land, but Moses told them that they would not succeed. That they would not succeed without God in their midst. Now, giving that overview right there, after all of that it was early the next morning, Bemalada, right? That the Israelites, the Beta Israel or the Yisrael Lijoch, that they set out to the promised land. They say, yes, okay, we're gonna make that aliyah, we're gonna repatriate, You understand? We're going to repatriate, right? But Musa told them, la la, lo lo. You know, he told them that it would not succeed without Ha Elohim, the true and the living God, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, the God of the Trinity, right, being in their midst. But they march forward anyway. In other words, the people are going to do what the people are going to do. Now, that being done, the Amalekites and the other 6 or so Canaanites. See, some people call the Amalekites Canaanites. The Amalekites are not Canaanites. They're part of the Nephilim. You understand? The Nephilim and like the Anak. We're going to touch on who's who on the face of the planet Earth, because not everybody that so-called appears to be human are actually human. I mean, it sounds strange, but it's the only explanation for such inhuman acts that we have clear evidence for countless centuries and years and millennia even. But the Amalekites and the Canaanites, they dealt them a shattering and a smattering blow at a place called Hormah. At a place called Hormah in Numbers chapter 14, verse 44. And what's I find personally interesting, I'm just going to testify on this. We just completed the book of Ruth, a translation and a treatment of the book of Ruth. And in going over some notes, some connectivity of it, we had came across Hormah. And it was interesting that we was reading about Hormah actually earlier, not being fully conscious at that time that this name right here, Hormah, would actually come up in this sabbatical reading, but it's actually happened before. And we want to leave off actually touching on this Hormah. What does Hormah mean in this context? Hormah means shut in, devoted, consecrated, like harem, dedicated, an asylum, a sanctuary, never to be redeemed, devoted to destruction, destroyed, laid waste, exterminated, the fortress. Because this particular place right here, it is interesting because this is the place that the Israelites, not listening to Moses, Moses said that if you're going to go in to conquer the land, right, if you're going to go in the promised land, you all need to have God in your midst. Remember, at the beginning of the chapter, the people said, oh, we want to just die in the wilderness. The beginning of chapter 14. The folks say, basically, we want to just die. It would have been better for us to just die in the wilderness. Because they were complainers, they were grumblers, you know, basically like niggas, you know, exactly. Or read Zechulque Mi'raf Asar Arat, you understand? We find that they say in verse 2, actually 1 and 2, verse 1, Machiberum hulu adimat achawina nisato chohu hizbuma bezia leilita lekasu. And all the congregation, the Machiber, lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. They cried all night. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? It was like Dr. King being killed, or Malcolm X being killed, or something like that. Kennedy. You know what I mean? I mean, that was something that you have to picture Negroes. You have to see black people. We have to see ourselves in it. Otherwise, we won't understand who we are and where we're at in this particular struggle. Kuter Hulet, verse 2 of chapter 14, it says, Yes, Aralim Alijoj Hulu, Be Musena, Be Aron Laya Gorema Remu, Machiberum Hulu, Be Gibit Amidara Salena Mino, Be Motinoro. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. Remember that we didn't touch on it, or at least we didn't post it from last week's study, 36, the sabbatical portion, the kufl from the Ori. but it was touching on how Miriam got the leprosy because of the incident concerning Moses and his Ethiopian wife, so forth and so on, how she had got leprosy and everything until she calmed her ass down, basically, you understand, and didn't, you know, exceed her britches. You know what I'm saying? Because she's a prophetess, but you have to understand people will be who people would be. You understand? Which is a lesson for us, an example for us, what sort of people we should be in the King of Kings and his Christ. But they murmured, right, in the whole congregation. They said to them, Moses and Aaron, would God that we had died in the land of Egypt. In other words, it would have been better, like word of God, it would have been better if we had died in the land of Egypt. Or, in other words, some said that they longed to be back in Egypt. It's like you take all these Negroes, take everybody, and you take them to Ethiopia, take them to Shashamane, and you take them there, you understand, and they get a little difficulty. You understand? They don't know how to farm land, so probably food production is low for a year or two. You understand? Things aren't the way, you know, they don't have the bling bling and all the other kind of things. And, you know what I mean? They're going to cry, oh, we should have died in America in the ghetto. You understand? Or we should have died in this particular wilderness. Now, and they even blame God. In verse 3, they say, and wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land? What is it? Lemon yagabana. Like, why has he caused us to die by the sword? Say totachina lijochachina merko yohonalu. What a gibbet meles aya shalenim aya shalenimin aluacho. And wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return to Egypt? And this is what has happened also with, you know, Shashamane and with other grants of our promised land in Africa. They even went so far in the next verse, which is interesting. Nu alik shomen what a good in meles tebabalu. And they said one to another, let us make a captain, let us choose some nigger to represent us, and let us return to Egypt. So if you take the niggers out of the ghetto, take them to Africa, the promised land, Ethiopia, the Holy Land, they still being not the right people, as Haile Selassie said, next time send the right people, they will exhibit these same sort of traits. So we have to learn the wisdom of how to distinguish these from those. You understand? Now, Moses and Aaron, as we already discussed, they fell on their faces. You understand? They prayed. You understand? Moses was told by the Almighty, get out the way, let me kill these people off. Then Moses did some PR and said, listen, what would the Egyptians, what would the other people think? You know, how would that be for you? Because you are this and you are that, and you are, you know, for kind, forgiving, merciful, generous, you understand, excusing iniquity and stuff, you know, like that. And the Almighty relented. Now, at the end of the chapter, the people decide on their own, basically, that we're going to go into the promised land. I mean, look at the double-mindedness. Look at the double-minded. What's probably happening is that where they were at, being desert, there wasn't too much food. Things were getting a little difficult, and they were thinking, well, these people bring back all this food. You understand? We must be able to fight for hunger's sake. And the Amalekites and the Canaanites, you understand, Israel was driven back. They were driven back. This is interesting. They were driven back into the desert. They were coming out of the desert, and they were driven back into the desert. But the main thing is that they ignored the warning of Moses. And this place called Hormah, right, which is also contained elsewhere in Numbers 21 and 3, for example. And Yahweh Jehovah hearkened to the voice of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites and utterly destroyed them and their cities, and the name of the place was called Hormah. In the margin, it means devoted, and it's given in the place of utterly destroyed. And we are told that Hormah is the same, from the same root as Haram, a devoted thing or a cursed thing, sometime in translation, which means some things were devoted things. They were a curse for you to touch, but they were God's things. In other words, God's things is a curse for you if you have no authorization to touch these things. Hormah was also a city that Judah and Simeon took from the Canaanites. And the number of Canaanites, there were 6 tribes. It's important for us to understand there were about 6 tribes of the Canaanites, but there were other tribes that were of the giants, and it was allotted to Simeon in Judges 1 and 17, Joshua 19 and 4. In Joshua 15 and 30, Hormah is mentioned as a city of Judah. By that time it was conquered by the tribe of Judah. But metaphysically speaking about Hormah, it's a seeming paradox in Christian overcoming, the letting go and utter destruction of error beliefs. This is what this name means. Remember how we always mention that names are very, very important? Whenever you come across a name that's like a Hebrew name, or a name you maybe can't pronounce, or a name you don't know what it really means, that's a gem. That's like a diamond in the rough right there. You understand? Never skip over those names. Make a note of it and find an opportunity to study the name, what the name means, all the nuance of meaning, then go back to the text or the original inference or reference. You understand? With that new knowledge and intelligence, and the text will come to life. You will really get an overstanding. You understand? Knowledge, wisdom, overstanding. So the seeming paradox in Christian overcoming is the letting go and utter destruction of error beliefs and ideas. And at the same time, the devoting or dedicating, consecrating to God, to high and spiritual use of all the energy, all the substance, all the power, the faith, the intelligence, and strength that we have been given to the promotion of error. In other words, when Moses told them that without God in your midst you would not be successful, and the Israelites still went ahead to try to conquer the land, and the Amalekites and the Canaanites beat them back into the desert, sent them back, is explained by this meaning. When we give up old activities and deny them out of consciousness, but they did not give up those old activities. There was no repentance on their part after what they said about we should have just died, and Moses and God brought us out here to die. Moses and Aaron and God brought us out here to die. It appears at first as though we are putting away our very life, our power of action, of accomplishment, of usefulness. This, however, is not the case. All the good, all the powers of being that in our ignorance we use to perpetrate the error, just like niggers and lost sheep are using all that they have to perpetrate the error of America, of Babylon, of being lost sheep, is preserved and is set up into constructive action to our upbuilding and spiritualizing of our organism. Thus, Hormah, this place of overcoming to us, becomes a fortress and a sanctuary, a place of retreat. But we understand now what the first level of that retreat was, and seclusion, an asylum for many of our inner thoughts during process of adjustment in consciousness. So what the Israelites needed by getting beat back after not listening to Moses and murmuring and everything else, was they were getting an attitude or a consciousness readjustment, but one that was a costly consciousness readjustment. So this also teaches us that we cannot approach repatriation or approach the Rastafari, the ALIYAH. We cannot approach it from our own man-made and our own way of looking at it, you know, a secular way of looking at it. We must be born again. We must be regenerated. We must seek to learn what His will and His wisdom and His instruction about this matter is, so that we will be successful in coming out of Babylon and returning to our promised land, so that we can and will be blessed according to His word and according to the truth. So more to come, Yah willing, hopefully, on this particular subject matter. We went a little bit over time on this rate here, but once again, Shabbat Shalom, Senbet Salam. This is the 37th Torah portion, and reading, known in the Hebrew as Shalach Leka or Shlach Leka, and in the Royal Amharic as Lak Tilkalachu. Lak Tilkalachu. So until then, Shabbat Shalom, Senbet Salam.